Thanks very much, Ray. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight and staying to the end of the session to listen to my take on mobile research in a global context. Before I start, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're not going to cover today so that you understand what we are going to cover today. So this is not a how-to session about designing mobile questionnaires or mobile qual projects. If you'd like to learn more about those, there are plenty of other places that you can learn about those things. So as Ray mentioned, Ray and I and Naveen Williams wrote a book a few years ago called the Handbook of Mobile Market Research. So you could go to that book to pick up some of the basics. Alternatively, if you visit the NewMR Play Again page, there's a variety of talks there where people are sharing their expertise in the mobile market research world. You could visit the University of Georgia's MRII and have a look at their Principles of Mobile Market Research course. And of course, there's a wide variety of conferences, papers, reading, online resources. So there's lots of places you can learn about those things. So what are we going to talk about today? And I'm really going to be talking about what you need to think about if you want to conduct mobile market research across the globe. So I'm not talking about you need to do a mobile market research project in the UK or in the US. This is about taking in, the broad spectrum of countries and, the differences between them. First thing that's helpful to think about when you're thinking about how to get started in mobile research is to think about the various different dimensions, because mobile research is a very big field. We're not just talking about qualitative, we're not just talking about quantitative, we're not just talking about an individual technique. We're talking about a device that's become the center of many people's lives, and we can do a wide variety of different types of research with it. So one of the first dimensions I think of, and that's probably because we're thinking about the mobile telephone, is are you using it as a voice device or a self-complete device? And by that I mean, are you going to ring somebody's telephone and talk to them? So in that case, we're talking really about something like a traditional caddy interviewer. You have an interviewer reading questions. Or are you talking about using the phone so that people can undertake a research task? Now that could be a survey, it could be some sort of mobile qual exercise, it could be a diary study, but do you have an interviewer or does the person complete the task themselves? Now, both of these components are big elements of research. There's lots of caddy mobile voice studies conducted, and there's a lot of self-complete tasks done. So they're both big components. There's some specific things to think about if you actually are thinking of using the telephone as a way of conducting a caddy interview. At the moment, most people who are doing this would be talking about using it in the context of a dual frame study. So some people would be taking part on their mobile telephone, but some people will be contacted on a landline telephone. Now, that's something that we will probably see change going forward. Various predictions out there as to whether it will be, something that happens in 2 years or 3 years. To a certain extent, it depends really on who your audience is. If you're doing a caddy survey with younger people, you may be quite happy to go mobile only now. If getting a broad cross-section of the population is what you need to do, you're probably still sticking with dual frame for the time being. If you're particularly interested in this, there's a nice paper that came out earlier this year from the Pew Research Group, and it talks about, are we in the twilight of landline interviewing? And they've compared some of their large-scale studies and had a look at what would have happened if we only rang people on their mobile phones. So that's a nice resource to have a look at. Now, the next thing to think about is, are you doing a mobile-only study, or are you doing what we would call a dual-mode study? Now, at the moment in the research world, although we hear a lot of talk about mobile, the component of research that is mobile only is actually quite small. I think SMR and their GMR report are actually sort of estimating that that's around about 4%. Whereas dual mode, and by that I mean online studies where some people are taking part using, a laptop or a PC, and other people are taking part in mobiles, is actually the biggest component of mobile research. Estimates, vary a little bit, but I think most people probably agree that it's somewhere around about 40% of online studies are completed via people using their mobiles. So you also need to think about what sort of device are you, going to use in your mobile research. So for most people conducting mobile studies, they're really talking about people using smartphones or tablets. There is a small component of research that's done on sort of other mobile devices, but again, that's really quite small. Then another big debate that's been going on for a while is really the browser versus app debate. Now, are you conducting your mobile research with the person using their web browser on a mobile phone? So in many ways, it's a similar task to completing an online survey on a computer, but you're dealing with a smaller screen and different sorts of operating systems. At the moment, the browser share of mobile research is much larger than the app share, but the app option does bring some different types of options into research. Certainly, if you're planning to do research where you need to tap into some of the functionality of the phone, so if you need to be able to get to the GPS or perhaps use something like the accelerometer or some of the other sensors on the phone, an app-based solution is what will really help you do that. Apps also are used quite a lot when we're talking about CAPI-style studies. So you might be sending interviewers out with tablets to conduct interviews in a central location, at an event, in a shopping centre. Those are quite often app-based. Panel companies might use apps to sign their members up and have them kind of engaged with them through an app. And particularly in the context of global research, an app solution can sometimes help when you've got patchy or poor quality internet. So if you can't rely on a good steady stream of internet, you could be using an app so that the data can be stored locally until such point as you're back in an area with good internet access, or even back at the office and syncing data that way. So certainly the app doesn't sometimes enable you to extend what you're able to do. Then, of course, there's the dimension that we often talk about in all research, is the qual versus quant. Now, the vast majority of mobile research will be done from the quant perspective, but many of the interesting and fun presentations you see at conferences where people are doing great stuff with videos, voice analytics, locations, biometrics, those are often done through, like the qual paradigm at the moment. Now, another thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about qual versus quant, because of the smaller scale of qual, you've often got some options that you just can't afford to use when you're talking about quant. So if you're wanting to conduct qualitative research with a group of people and you discover that they don't have the right sorts of devices, in a small-scale project with a relatively small sample, loaning people devices might be an option. In fact, for some studies, even giving people devices that they can keep afterwards as an incentive might actually be something that is within your budget when you're talking about a qual study. So there's certainly some options there that you can use. So why have we been so interested in mobile? And one of the really simple reasons is it is actually one of the fastest growing technologies in history. In some countries, more people have access to mobile services than have bank accounts or electricity or clean water. So that starts to give you, some sense of the scale of mobile connectivity across the world. So if you're thinking about taking your mobile research globally, there really is a lot of things that you need to consider. And the idea of this simple checklist is to set up a framework to start you thinking about how you can conduct global mobile research. So to get started, there are really three areas that you need to focus on, and that's the who, the what, and the how. And so by who, what I'm challenging you to think about is, in the countries you'd like to conduct research in, who are the people who have mobile devices? Then to move on to what sort of devices do they have, And how do those people use and interact with their device? So if we initially start thinking about the who of mobile, the idea of thinking about how many mobile devices there are in the world is a great place to get started. So there are 7 million mobile device subscriptions. Now, what I mean by that is an active SIM card. So if you have a mobile phone, it will have a SIM in it. That's one mobile subscription. If you also own an iPad that's got a SIM card in it, that's a second mobile subscription. So many of people who are on the line today, and many of the people that you interact with and work with, will have many more than one mobile device. You may have two, you may have three, you probably know people who have many more than that. They may have 5 or 6. Now, we know that there are 7.6 billion people in the world. So sometimes when you read reports about research and how many people have mobile devices, people do the simple maths and say 7 billion people, 7.6 billion people and 7 billion mobile devices. Wow, almost everybody has a mobile. And we know that's not true. We know that lots of people have more than that. So there are people out there who don't have mobile devices, and we need to think about, when we conduct research, what that means. There are a number of references that might be helpful to you, because if you're going into specific countries, you're going to need to look at this information in quite a bit of detail for the countries that you're thinking about conducting research in. So the report on the left is the Measuring the Information Society report, and that comes out from the ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Union, and there's a link to that report just on the bottom of that slide there. That's a freely available report, and it's packed full of information about the sorts of things we're talking about tonight. So if you're thinking about doing any sort of global mobile research, that would be one of the first places I'd start looking for some of this information. There's 2 other reports on that page there. Both of them are from SMR. You do have to be a member to access those reports for free, and they are also available for purchase. So a lot of the stats we see tonight will come from the Measuring the Information Society report. There are large variations across the world in terms of the penetration of mobile devices. In countries like Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, the Republic of Korea and Malaysia, there's really very, very high mobile phone ownership. Almost everybody has a mobile. And then you can look at countries like Myanmar and Bangladesh, and you can see there that only about 40% of sort of a broadly adult population have a mobile phone. So you can start to see the implications that might have if you're wanting to conduct research in somewhere like Bangladesh. If you're going to conduct research globally, you need to get a sense of what sort of tech development there is in the countries you're thinking about. And the ITU in that report I'm talking about talk about an Ict Development Index, which they use the acronym IDI for. And what they're attempting to do is rank countries in terms of their ICT sophistication, if you like. Now, in this map here, we've got some color coding. So you can see that countries like the USA, Canada, Europe, Australia and New Zealand all have really highly developed ICT systems. What that means is, for those countries, you've got really lots of options for the sorts of technology and mobile devices you could use in your research. Then the next tier down, where you've got the blue color coded countries, you've still got a wide number of options, but you might not be able to do everything you would like. And then when you start getting down to the green and yellow coded countries, you need to check what you would be able to do there. But don't automatically assume, because a country is low on this ICT index, that you can't conduct research there. It certainly might be possible, and sometimes there are some clever or innovative or even just different solutions to conducting research. You might not be using a smartphone, but you might be using something, with a short SMS survey. So there are other options, and certainly don't write them off without thinking about what you might be able to do. So it's sort of interesting to think about why people would not have mobile phones when, you know, we see them being so ubiquitous in our daily lives. And again, the ITU report outlines some reasons. And I think the first two on this list, you know, are potentially connected. And it's about, you know, that it's not affordable, and, you know, something like your phone's broken or stolen, and, you know, possibly you can't afford to replace it. Another thing that is important to bear in mind is that in richer countries, mobile phone usage costs are actually less, often in absolute terms and always in relative terms, cheaper than in poorer countries. So that tends to mean that for people in less developed and poorer countries, they will be paying a much higher proportion of their, you know, discretionary income or income generally to access your mobile solutions. Some people just say they don't need a mobile phone. And then we've got the issue of, you know, the quality of mobile access and coverage. And so if you're planning to do research in a country where there isn't good quality mobile access or even good quality coverage, you need to think about what that would mean for your project, and, you know, is it feasible, or do you need some backup solutions? Again, some people say they don't have the technical skills to use a mobile device, and obviously if you were thinking about conducting research, that's something you really need to think about as well. And then operator trust is another reason. Now, why we think a lot about who has a mobile phone and who doesn't have a mobile phone is, you know, we're really thinking about the impact on our sample. Now, we do get some, you know, reasonably good information about who is less likely to be on mobile. And some of those kind of demographic profiles are surprisingly consistent across the world. We quite often see that it's the people with the lowest income levels who don't have access to mobile. People in rural areas often don't. Age is another characteristic that is linked to mobile usage. Old people, and particularly very old people, almost everywhere in the world are less likely to be using mobiles. And in some countries, younger people, and particularly the very young people, are less likely to do so. Often that is, you know, interlinked with, you know, things like lower income levels. People with lower education levels are less likely to be on mobile, and women in some countries are less likely to have mobiles. So the fact that there are these differences doesn't mean that you can't use mobile for research, but it doesn't mean you need to think about what the impact of these factors are on your sample. You know, so it might be that you need to, you know, pick up certain participant groups through different modes, or it might be that you need to, you know, make some adjustments, apply some weights to your sample. It might be something that you can't adjust for, but you actually need to be aware of when you're conducting the analysis and your interpretation. And you also need to think about what it is that you're researching. So for people using social research and needing to get really high quality samples of, you know, the broadest base of the population, this might be more of a problem than people who are perhaps researching, you know, more expensive consumer products that people on low incomes and low education levels wouldn't be able to buy anyway. So a mobile sample might reflect your target market quite nicely. So you need to be aware of these things and think about what they mean for your research. Now, another thing that's really important to keep in mind, that the situation can change very quickly when we're talking about mobile. This is a chart. Now, I know you can't read the countries running along the bottom, so don't even try to. Just look at the blue bar and the yellow bar. Now, the blue bar is the proportion of internet users accessing the internet via mobile in 2010, and the yellow bar is the same figure in 2015. So you can see that in many, many countries across the world, that figure increased enormously between 2010 and 2015. So things are changing. and they're changing quickly. And it also highlights that you really do need to keep getting accurate data. You can't really rely on data that's a year or two old. You need to get the most up-to-date data that you can when you're looking at these sorts of issues. So if we now move on and have a look at the what, and by that I mean what types of devices are people using. Now, I think generally when people are talking about mobile research, they're really talking about smartphones. Now, we know that there are 2 billion smartphones out there, so that's about 30% of mobiles. So certainly there are a lot of mobile devices out there that are not smartphones. And then even within the smartphone market, there's different sorts of smartphones. Now, most people who are listening in today probably have what we would call like a bells and whistles smartphone. Good quality, lots of add-ons, great camera, lots of functionality. But there are certainly, and in more recent years, there's been a huge growth in really quite cheaply priced smartphones, particularly in the developed world. So not necessarily all smartphones are created equal. So as you're doing research around the globe, you need to get a sense of, you know, what sorts of devices are people using, what functions are quite common, what sort of brands, what sort of operating systems. And there is also the other 70% of devices that are not smartphones. So we used to call these feature phones. That's a term that's probably, you know, come out of use, but certainly not smartphones. You also need to think about what your operating system you're likely to be working with. The sales of phones in Q2 of this year, you know, 88% of them were using the Android operating system. The iOS operating systems down to 12%, but then there are still some countries where the iOS or Apple brand is actually much stronger than that. So you need to get a sense of, you know, which operating system you're likely to be dealing with. That's a bit less of an issue than it used to be, but still worth keeping in mind. And also, you know, not all Android is created equal too. You need to get a sense of what versions of the different operating systems people are using in those countries. So if we move on now to have a look at the how, there's quite a few things that you need to think about, and I'll just run through some of those quickly. So you need to think about what sort of contracts people have, and these vary, you know, quite a bit. Now, in some parts of the world, people will have a contract that's sort of all-inclusive. You'll pay a flat fee for the month, you know, have pretty generous call limits, pretty generous download usage. So if we ask somebody with a contract like that to take part in a study, the amount of data that we're asking them to use out of their, you know, sort of monthly allowance might only be a very small component, so it's not likely to, you know, cause them any particular inconvenience. But if we're talking about people who perhaps have pay-as-you-go contracts, or certainly in the parts of the world where, you know, mobile functionality and access is really quite expensive, if we ask somebody to use a large amount of their, say, monthly limit to conduct a survey, we've, you know, caused them inconvenience and probably incurred them some costs. So we need to think about, you know, what are the best ways that we can, you know, handle that. Are we perhaps offering offline options, or the ability to use Wi-Fi for some of our things? Which also takes us nicely to incentives. So whilst we might offer incentive purely as an incentive, we also might like to be partly reimbursing people for costs they've incurred. And certainly there are different solutions around the globe for providing incentives on mobile, and certainly in countries, you know, around Africa and some of the developing world, there are some quite neat solutions for paying people, you know, small amounts of money and things like airtime. So there's some sections on that in the Handbook of Mobile Market Research if you'd like to follow that up. Recruitment's another thing to think about. Certainly panel companies have made conducting online research samples and access to them, you know, quite easy, but there aren't always details about whether people have mobiles or not, and certainly in different parts of the world, panels may be less established or smaller numbers of people, so you might not be able to do the sorts of things that you're used to. There are also different ways of recruiting people. There are certainly companies like On Device who, have some innovative ways of picking people, up from their internet activities, and another company, ReWe, have some nifty ways of, recruiting people from their online behaviour. Another really important to think about is laws and regulations. Now, if you're operating across many, many countries, you're going to need to know what's going on in those places. What are the laws you need to follow? What are the regulations you need to follow? Certainly partnering with local companies can be helpful for that, but also organisations like SMR and then sort of local research societies can be a good place to go as well. Language literacy and script. Now, that's a big area, but just to touch on, obviously you need to know what languages you need to do your studies in those countries. Do you need to have multiple languages operating? But also you need to think about what language means for scripts. So if you've originally designed your questionnaire in English, is that still going to work when a language is, say, much more verbose, or when it's a script that's, read from left to right or right to left or up and down the screen? So there's quite a bit to think about there. And also literacy. In some countries, large proportions of your population may not actually be that fluent in terms of writing their own local language, regardless of what it is. Which really takes us to, don't discount the need to have local know-how. And I mean, that's across the whole range of bullet points on this slide. You really do need to know the laws, what is standard practice, how are people expecting these things to work, and through to really quite detailed information about, what sorts of mobiles people will have, are they going to be new, are they going to be old? So there's lots of things there, and actually having a good local partner can be a really great place to start. So if you're thinking of taking your mobile research more global, hopefully this checklist will guide you through what you need to do, and if you can tick off each of those, you'll be in a good starting point for working out how to develop a framework for conducting mobile research globally. So thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to answer any questions that you might have.